There is no line in any American trade law that mentions smoke. Not wildfire smoke, not pollution, not air quality of any kind. And yet, standing in the Oval Office this week, the President of the United States looked at reporters and said the United States is going to put a big tariff on Canada because of the smoke. Not because of cars, not because of dairy, not because of alcohol, because of smoke drifting across a border that no tariff law in American history was ever written to cover. If that sounds like it should not be possible, stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what was said, why more than 100 million Americans are breathing this same smoke right now, why trade experts are saying flatly that there is no legal basis for this at all, and why the fact that it might not hold up in any court does not mean it does not matter. Subscribe to Power Map and turn on notifications because this trade war just found a front nobody saw coming, and we are going to track exactly what happens to it. Here is what actually happened. Speaking in the Oval Office this week, right after an unrelated announcement about American nuclear energy, President Trump was asked about Canada, and he did not talk about cars or dairy or alcohol, the categories already facing a 50% tariff next month. He talked about smoke. Quote, "We're going to put a big tariff on Canada because of the smoke," end quote. He went further in writing, saying that the billions of dollars in costs the United States has absorbed because of the air pollution must, in his words, of necessity be added to the tariffs Canada is currently paying. He wrote that the United States is holding Canada responsible for, quote, "not properly maintaining their forests and brush," end quote, and said the country is being, quote, "unnecessarily invaded by filthy, polluted, and unhealthy air," end quote. Now, before you dismiss this as just another Truth Social post, understand the scale of what he is actually reacting to, because the underlying wildfire crisis is completely real. Massive wildfires have been burning across Canada for weeks this summer, forcing evacuations in multiple provinces. Air quality alerts are currently active for more than 100 million people across the United States. And smoke from those fires is sitting over major American cities right now: Minneapolis, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York City among them. This is not a minor inconvenience. Hospitals in affected regions have reported spikes in respiratory complaints. Outdoor events have been canceled. School districts have moved recess indoors. So whatever you think of turning this into a tariff threat, the underlying grievance, smoke crossing the border and affecting the health of tens of millions of Americans, is not manufactured. That part is entirely real. Translate that into an actual household for a second. A parent in Minneapolis deciding whether their child with asthma can go outside for recess. An outdoor summer festival in Chicago quietly canceled because the air quality index crossed into the unhealthy range for the third time in a month. A construction crew in Detroit cutting an outdoor shift short because visibility and air quality both dropped at once. None of these people are thinking about tariff schedules. They are thinking about whether it is safe to open a window. That is the real human layer underneath a story that is about to get discussed almost entirely in terms of legal authority and trade statutes. Here is where it gets complicated, and here is the part almost nobody explaining this story is walking you through carefully. American tariff law, every version of it, Section 301, Section 232, and Section 338, the same obscure 1930 statute already being used against Canada right now for the existing 50% tariffs, was built around one specific idea: a foreign country is discriminating against American commerce, meaning it is treating American goods or American companies worse than it treats goods or companies from anywhere else. That is the legal trigger. That is the only trigger. There is no provision anywhere in that body of law for a natural disaster. Wildfire smoke is not a trade practice. It is not a tariff, a quota, a subsidy, or a regulation. It is smoke produced by fires that Canada did not create on purpose and cannot simply switch off. Walk through the three main tools a president actually has, because understanding what each one requires is exactly why this threat sits outside all of them. Section 301 requires a formal investigation by the United States Trade Representative into a specific unfair trade practice, with hearings and a public comment period before any tariff can be imposed. Section 232 requires a national security finding, typically tied to a specific industry, steel, aluminum, semiconductors, something with a defense or supply chain rationale attached to it. Section 338, the law already being used against Canadian cars, dairy, and alcohol right now, requires a finding that a foreign country is discriminating against American commerce specifically, treating American goods worse than goods from other countries. Every single one of those three tools is built around a country doing something, a policy, a regulation, a market restriction. None of them are built around a country's weather. A wildfire is not a policy choice. Nobody in the Canadian government voted for the fires to start. And no tariff statute anywhere asks whether a natural disaster was handled to Washington's satisfaction. Laura Dawson, a trade expert who has spent years studying exactly this kind of dispute, put it about as plainly as anyone in this field ever does. Quote, "There's absolutely no basis in trade law for wildfire smoke," end quote. That is not a partisan talking point. That is a description of how the actual statutes are written. You can search every trade authority a president has ever used, going all the way back to the 1930s. And you will not find one designed to let the White House tariff a country over pollen or weather, or in this case, smoke from a fire. So why does this matter if it has no legal foundation at all? Here is the answer, and it is the reason this story is worth your attention, even though nothing has actually been signed yet. This threat did not happen in isolation. It landed at the end of what reporters covering the story themselves described as another week of escalating trade tension between the two countries. Just days earlier, the administration had already signed 3 separate proclamations under that same 1930 law, adding a 50% tariff on Canadian cars, dairy, and alcohol, set to take effect next month. Behind the scenes, negotiators on both sides are already navigating a stalled review of the entire North American trade agreement, with disagreements over Canadian dairy quotas, digital content rules, and government procurement policy. Into that already tense environment, a completely new, completely untested grievance just got added publicly, live, on camera, with no advance warning, and no legal mechanism attached to it yet. Think about what that actually signals, regardless of whether it ever becomes a real tariff. When a president is willing to publicly threaten a trading partner over something a court would almost certainly say falls outside every existing tariff statute, that tells you something about the temperature of the entire relationship right now. This is not a carefully drafted policy proposal that came out of a trade office after months of review. This is a reaction delivered in real time, folded into an unrelated press event, about a genuinely serious public health crisis that happens to be affecting American cities at the exact same moment as a separate, already bitter trade dispute. The line between an environmental grievance and a trade grievance appears to be disappearing in real time. And that is worth watching closely, because if this administration finds a way to formalize it, even loosely, under some reinterpreted authority, it would be the first time in American history that a natural disaster became the stated basis for a tariff. And here is a detail worth sitting with for a moment. Every other tariff fight in this saga, the 50% duties on cars and dairy and alcohol, the earlier rounds under emergency powers that the Supreme Court eventually struck down, at least had a paper trail, a proclamation, a statute being invoked, however obscure, a discrimination claim, however contested. This threat has none of that yet. It exists only as spoken words in a press availability and a social media post. That makes it simultaneously the least legally serious action in this entire trade war, and in a strange way, the most revealing one, because it shows what the underlying instinct looks like without any legal packaging around it at all. Now, to be fair to the seriousness of the underlying issue, cross-border air pollution is not a new subject in the relationship between these two countries. Canada and the United States have cooperated on air quality issues for decades, going back to agreements on acid rain in the 1980s that eventually led to a formal air quality agreement between the two governments, because airborne pollution genuinely does not respect a border drawn on a map. That agreement, and the decades of joint monitoring that followed it, were built as cooperative frameworks, two governments working together on a shared airshed, not as a mechanism for one country to financially penalize the other. Smoke from Canadian wildfires has affected American cities before, and it will again, just as smoke from American wildfires in the Pacific Northwest and California has drifted north into Canadian cities in past fire seasons. The two countries share a continent, and continents share air. What is new here is not the smoke crossing the border. What is new is the specific idea of pricing that smoke into a tariff schedule, treating a shared environmental reality as if it were a one-sided trade violation rather than the joint problem both countries have always treated it as. There is also a pattern worth naming here for anyone who has followed this trade war closely. This is not the first time this administration has reached for a new justification once an earlier one ran into legal trouble. Broad emergency powers tariffs, justified initially on fentanyl and border security grounds, were struck down by the Supreme Court earlier this year. The administration's response was not to retreat. It was to reach for an older, more obscure statute, the 1930 law now being used against Canadian cars, dairy, and alcohol. Every time one legal foundation gets challenged, a new one gets tried in its place. A wildfire smoke justification, even without a clear statute attached to it yet, fits that same pattern, another possible foundation being tested out loud, in public, before anyone commits to building the legal paperwork around it. Whether that paperwork ever gets built is a separate question from whether the pattern itself tells you something about how this administration approaches trade pressure generally. There is a business uncertainty cost buried in all of this too, separate from whether any of it survives a courtroom. Companies that move goods across this specific border already had to reprice their entire cost structure once, when the 50% tariffs on cars, dairy, and alcohol were announced. A second, entirely different threat, with no clear scope and no clear timeline, adds a second layer of uncertainty on top of the first. Import planning, inventory decisions, and cross-border investment all get harder to model when the list of what might get taxed keeps growing before the last round has even taken effect. That uncertainty has a real cost, even in the scenario where this specific threat never becomes an actual signed tariff. So what actually happens next? There are a few realistic paths from here. The most likely one, based on how similar threats have played out earlier in this same trade war, is that this remains rhetorical, a pressure tactic dropped into negotiations to keep Canada off balance while the real, already signed 50% tariffs approach their August deadline and the broader trade agreement review continues. A second, less likely path is that the administration tries to formalize this under some existing authority by reframing it, perhaps folding an environmental cost claim into a broader discrimination argument tied to forestry management policy, which would immediately invite the same kind of legal challenge already being prepared against the existing tariffs. A third path, and the one nobody can fully rule out at this stage, is that nothing further happens at all. And this becomes one more entry in a long list of trade threats that never converted into an actual signed action. What you should actually watch for is straightforward. First, watch whether the White House issues anything in writing beyond social media posts, a memorandum, a request for a formal review, anything that starts building an actual paper trail the way the existing 50% tariffs already have. Second, watch how Ottawa responds, officially, not just in background commentary, because a formal Canadian government reaction would tell you whether this is being treated internally as a serious escalation or dismissed as noise. Third, watch the wildfire situation itself, because if the fires worsen and air quality alerts expand further across the American Midwest and Northeast, the political pressure to be seen doing something, even something without legal grounding, only grows. Fourth, and this is the one worth watching most closely, watch whether this threat gets folded into the broader trade agreement negotiations happening right now, because if Washington starts using it as leverage at the table, even without ever formalizing an actual tariff, it becomes a real bargaining chip, regardless of whether it would survive a single day in court. One more angle worth considering, because it cuts against the simplest reading of this story. It is possible that this threat is never meant to become a real signed tariff at all, and that its entire purpose is rhetorical, a way of signaling frustration and applying pressure inside an ongoing negotiation without ever needing to survive a legal challenge. Under that reading, the specific legal weakness of the claim is not a flaw in the strategy. It is almost beside the point, because the goal was never a courtroom win. It was a headline and a message sent to Ottawa. If that is what is actually happening here, then watching for a formal proclamation may be the wrong thing to watch for entirely. The more revealing signal might simply be whether this threat gets repeated, whether it shows up again in the next press conference or the one after that, because a threat repeated enough times starts to function as policy, even without ever being written down as one. Here is the bigger picture worth carrying away from this story. Everything else in this trade war, the 50% tariffs on cars and dairy and alcohol, the stalled agreement review, the retaliation lists, the legal fights over century-old statutes, all of it at least operates inside a framework, contested as that framework may be. This is different. This is a head of state publicly floating the idea of taxing a neighboring country over the weather, with a trade expert on record saying plainly that no such legal basis exists anywhere in American law. Whether or not it ever becomes real, the fact that it was said out loud in the Oval Office in the middle of an already tense negotiation tells you something about where this relationship actually stands right now, underneath all the formal proclamations and press releases. Consider the alternative too, the version of this where none of it matters in 6 months. Plenty of tough talk in this trade war has stayed exactly that, tough talk, quietly dropped once the news cycle moved on to the next flashpoint. If the wildfires ease later this season and air quality alerts start clearing from American cities, the political pressure driving this specific threat eases with it, and there may simply be nothing left to escalate. That is a genuinely plausible outcome too, and it is worth holding both possibilities at once instead of assuming the loudest version of the story is automatically the one that plays out. We are going to keep tracking this alongside everything else in this trade war, the countdown to the existing 50% tariffs, the stalled agreement talks, and now this. If you want the version of this story that actually explains what has legal teeth and what is just pressure, that is exactly why Power Map exists. Subscribe now, hit the bell, and drop a comment below telling me this. Do you think this smoke threat ever turns into an actual tariff? Or is this pure negotiating pressure that quietly disappears once the real 50% tariffs take effect? Let me know what you think happens, because this trade war keeps finding new fronts nobody expected, and we will be here to explain the next one too.